Hi, my name is Brian Smith, and I own a tech company. Most people hear $40 million cybersecurity firm and assume I've mastered people the same way I've mastered code, that I can read anyone, predict problems before they hit, and lock down every weakness before it explodes. In my world, spotting patterns and closing vulnerabilities is how I got from a beat-up laptop at 26 to 3 offices and Fortune 500 clients by 32. But for all that, there was one thing I still couldn't figure out. Why the woman I love went quiet and cold every single time I mentioned meeting her family. Cheryl Rogers, who was my fiancée, walked into my life 3 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party in downtown Chicago. While everyone else networked and name-dropped, she stood on a cramped balcony, laughing about a bartender's third failed attempt at making her mocktail. She had this way of making chaos feel manageable, like she carried calm in her bones. When she asked what I did and I explained cybersecurity, she didn't glaze over or pretend to care. She just said, "So you're the person people call when everything falls apart." That line hooked me harder than any business pitch ever could. Our relationship built itself quietly, naturally. She was an interior designer with a gift for transforming cold, corporate spaces into places that felt human. My penthouse had looked like a tech showroom. Glass, steel, minimal furniture, maximum emptiness. She filled it with warmth, soft lighting, textured rugs, plants that somehow stayed alive, framed art that wasn't just expensive, but actually meant something. Sunday mornings became our thing. Farmers market runs, cooking together, her feet tucked under my legs on the couch while we read. I proposed on one of those mornings. No flash, no crowd, just us and a ring I'd carried in my jacket for 2 months. She cried and whispered, "Are you sure you want me?" Like she was damaged goods. I didn't understand the question then, but I do now. The engagement should have been the easy part. My parents flew in from Ohio, excited, already planning. My mom kept asking about meeting Cheryl's folks to coordinate the wedding. When I brought it up over breakfast one Saturday, Cheryl's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. All the color drained from her face. "They're really private people," she said quickly. "Long story. We'll figure it out later." Then she changed the subject so fast it gave me whiplash. At first I thought it was a normal family drama. Everyone has some version of it. But the pattern got harder to ignore. Any mention of her parents, and Cheryl found an exit. She had no childhood photos anywhere. Her social media started at college. Nothing before age 18. When I ask about growing up, she'd make jokes about being a weird kid and flip the conversation back to me. Then the little things started adding up. Every single night, Cheryl checked the front door lock twice. Not just once. She'd lock it, walk away, then come back and rattle the handle like she expected something to push through from the other side. She kept our bedroom window sealed even during summer heat waves when the air felt thick as soup. If someone knocked unexpectedly, delivery drivers, neighbors, she'd freeze completely, eyes locked on the door, breathing shallow and fast until I answered. The worst was the nightmares. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and find her sitting on the floor beside the bed, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. "Bad dream?" I'd ask, sliding down next to her. She'd give me this small, broken smile and say, "I'm okay, just couldn't sleep." But her hands would be shaking like she'd just escaped something terrible. During a client dinner one night, someone asked Cheryl where she grew up. Simple question, innocent. Her entire body went rigid. She mumbled East Coast and excused herself to the bathroom. 15 minutes later, I found her in the hallway, leaning against the wall, breathing like she'd just run a marathon. Her skin was clammy, her pupils wide. She looked absolutely terrified. Of a question about her hometown, that night, watching her sleep fitfully beside me, I made a decision I question 1,000 times later. I needed to know what happened to her. Not because I was nosy, but because the woman I love was carrying trauma so deep it was bleeding into everything we built together. And if we were building a life, I couldn't protect her from ghosts I couldn't see. The next day, while she was at a client meeting, I searched the apartment and I found answers. I took a half day off work, something I almost never did. Cheryl was across town presenting design proposals for a hotel renovation project. The apartment felt different when I was alone in it, with purpose, like I was trespassing in my own home. My hands felt wrong as I opened drawers, checked closet shelves, looked through boxes we'd stored and forgotten about. I found nothing at first. Just normal stuff. Old textbooks, work portfolios, random college keepsakes. Then I remembered the storage containers under our bed, boxes Cheryl had moved in with, but never fully unpacked in 3 years. I pulled them out one by one, carefully, like I was diffusing something dangerous. Most held exactly what you'd expect. Design sketches from school, photo albums from college trips, a shoebox full of ticket stubs and concert wristbands. Then, wedged between 2 photo albums, a small notebook slid out and hit the floor. It was beat up, edges frayed, cover scuffed from years of use. An elastic band held it together, barely. I sat on the bedroom floor with the notebook heavy in my hands. There's a specific kind of guilt you feel in that moment, standing at the edge of a line you swore you'd never cross. I told myself I was just checking to see if it was something important. The truth was uglier. I was desperate. Desperate to understand why the woman I love was terrified of me meeting her own parents. I opened the first page. The handwriting was younger than Cheryl's now, shakier. Cheryl Rogers, age 14. The date was 11 years ago. She is 25 now, which meant she'd been keeping this buried for more than a decade. The Cheryl in that diary was not the Cheryl I knew. Her words were cramped and uneven, sentences trailing off like her hand had been shaking while she wrote. She described her house feeling wrong, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She wrote about rules that changed without warning, getting screamed at for things that were fine yesterday, punished for breaking rules she didn't know existed. She mentioned Megan and Keith, but not the way teenagers normally write about their parents. Not mom and dad, but their first names, like they were strangers who happened to share her address. She wrote about their anger, their silence, their ability to make her feel crazy for reacting to things any normal person would run from. One entry stopped me cold. You can tell what kind of night it'll be by how Keith closes his car door in the driveway. Soft click means maybe I'm safe. Slam means run to your room, lock the door, stay quiet until morning. I had to set the notebook down. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. This was real. This happened to her. The woman humming in our kitchen every evening, planning flower arrangements and color schemes, had grown up in a house where she learned to decode her father's mood by the sound of a car door. I kept reading, even though everything in me screamed to stop. She described being afraid to eat dinner because anything, chewing too loud, asking for seconds, not finishing her plate, could trigger an explosion. She talked about Megan, her mother, as someone who watched everything happen and did nothing. There was an entry. Mom saw the bruise on my arm today. She asked if I was being clumsy again. I said yes. She nodded and walked away. Another entry, age 15. Keith grabbed my wrist so hard today I thought the bone would snap. He was smiling while he did it. Megan was in the next room folding laundry like nothing was happening. The casual horror of it, the way violence was just part of daily life, the mother's complete abandonment of her own daughter, made my stomach turn. Then I found the entry that broke me. Cheryl, age 15, wrote about hiding in her closet at 2 a.m. because she heard footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside her door. She described holding her breath, praying he wouldn't come in, feeling her heart pound so loud she was sure he could hear it through the wood. The entry ended. I can't keep living like this. But where would I even go? Who would believe me? Everyone thinks they're perfect. There were other entries, too. A teacher noticed bruises during gym class. Cheryl panicked, lied about falling off her bike. The teacher didn't push. A school counselor asked if everything was okay at home. Cheryl said yes, terrified of what Keith would do if she told the truth. She wrote, "Nobody actually wants to know. They ask because they're supposed to, but they're relieved when you lie." I closed the diary. My hands were shaking. The air in our apartment felt different, heavier, like I'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. The people who did this to her, who turned her childhood into years of calculated violence and fear, were the same people she was protecting me from by refusing contact. I stared at the notebook, then at my laptop sitting on the desk. The decision formed before I could second-guess it, but I couldn't just show up in Providence without more information. I needed proof, evidence, a trail that would lead me to the truth about what happened to Cheryl and whether it was still happening to others. First, I needed to request medical records. Then I'd go to Providence and find witnesses who remembered. And if Keith and Megan Rogers were still the monsters Cheryl survived, I'd make sure they faced consequences they'd dodged for far too long. Before I continue, if you're invested in this story and want to hear more revenge tales like this one, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss an episode. Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where my listeners are tuning in from. Now back to the story. The next morning, I started the process. I knew it would take time. Using my position as Cheryl's fiancé and documentation of our engagement, I filed formal requests for her childhood medical records from Providence General Hospital. The process required forms, notarized documents, and waiting periods that felt endless. I told myself I was doing this to protect her, but the guilt sat in my chest, like a stone. 2 weeks later, the records arrived. 9 emergency room visits, each one a story of violence disguised as accidents. I sat in my office staring at the pages, rage building with every entry. This was real, documented, undeniable. That's when I told Cheryl I had a business trip to Boston, a client meeting I couldn't reschedule. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have clients in the region, but the real destination was Providence, Rhode Island, 90 minutes south. I booked a rental car and a hotel under my company account, my hands shaking as I clicked confirm. I was crossing every line I'd sworn to respect. But every time doubt crept in, I saw that diary entry in my mind. 15-year-old Cheryl hiding in a closet at 2 a.m., terrified of her own father. The drive felt wrong the entire way. I'd spent years investigating digital threats, hackers, data breaches, corporate espionage. This was different. Physical, personal, dangerous in ways no firewall could protect against. Providence was smaller than Chicago, colonial architecture mixed with modern buildings. As I drove through Cheryl's childhood neighborhood, everything looked normal. Tree-lined streets, neat lawns, houses that belonged on greeting cards. The kind of place where people wave to neighbors and violence feels impossible. The kind of place where it hides best. I parked 2 blocks from the Rogers address. The house was exactly as I'd imagined from public records. Modest 2-story white siding, flower beds that looked carefully maintained. I sat in my rental car for 20 minutes, watching through the windshield, feeling ridiculous and determined at the same time. Megan Rogers appeared first. Mid-50s, thin, moving around the front yard with gardening tools. She looked completely ordinary, harmless, like someone's gentle aunt. The disconnect was staggering. This woman had watched her husband terrorize their daughter and done nothing. An hour later, Keith arrived. He was tall, solid build, probably played sports when he was younger. He parked in the driveway, grabbed his briefcase, exchanged a few words with Megan. From where I sat, they looked like any suburban couple. Normal, safe. It made me feel sick. I needed more than surveillance. I needed people who'd seen what happened behind that perfect facade. I found Providence East High School 20 minutes away, where Cheryl would have attended based on her age and address. The school day was ending, students flooding out the front doors. I went to the main office, introduced myself as someone researching family support systems in schools, vague enough to sound legitimate without being a complete lie. The administrative assistant was polite but cautious. I asked if any staff from 9 years ago still worked there. She mentioned Ms. Patricia Delgado, a guidance counselor who'd been at the school for 15 years. I found Ms. Delgado in her office, surrounded by college brochures and motivational posters. She was in her early 50s, warm but tired in the way educators get after years of watching kids struggle. When I mentioned Cheryl Rogers, something flickered across her face, recognition and regret. "I remember Cheryl," she said carefully. "Quiet girl, very talented artist. Why are you asking about her?" I shifted my approach, told the truth. I was Cheryl's fiancée, trying to understand her past because she wouldn't talk about it. Ms. Delgado's expression changed completely. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke. "Cheryl came to school with bruises more than once. She always had explanations. Sports injuries, accidents, clumsiness. But there was something off about it. She'd flinch if you raised your voice, even a little. She'd get anxious near the end of the school day, like she dreaded going home." I leaned forward. "Did you report it?" Ms. Delgado's face squeezed with old frustration. I asked her directly once if she felt safe. She looked terrified and said yes. I filed a report with the state anyway. Her parents were interviewed. They were polite, cooperative, said Cheryl was just accident-prone and had an active imagination. The case was closed. I pushed back, but I was told there wasn't enough evidence. She paused, her voice dropping. "I've thought about her for years. Wondered if she was okay. Hoped she got out." I thanked her and left, my mind racing. The system saw the signs. Adults noticed. Reports were filed. And still, nothing happened. Keith and Megan smiled, lied, and kept hurting their daughter, while teachers and social workers moved on to the next case. Sitting in my rental car, I stared at my phone. I could stop here, go home, talk to Cheryl, encourage therapy, let the past stay buried. Or I could keep digging, find proof, make sure Keith and Megan faced consequences they'd dodged for decades. I opened my laptop and started searching Providence hospital records. If Cheryl was injured repeatedly, there had to be a medical trail. and I was going to find every piece of it. I spent 3 days in Providence following the trail those medical records had revealed. The documents I'd received 2 weeks earlier painted a clear pattern, but I needed more than paper. I needed witnesses, people who'd seen what was happening and remembered. The records themselves were damning enough. 9 emergency room visits between ages 12 and 17, each injury conveniently explained away. But what made them truly devastating were the physician notes I'd almost missed, buried in the margins. Between ages 12 and 17, Cheryl Rogers visited Providence General Hospital emergency room 9 times. 9. Each visit told the same story with different words. Broken wrist, age 13, patient reports falling downstairs. Concussion, age 14, patient struck head on cabinet door. Dislocated shoulder, age 15, patient injured during recreational activity. Fractured ribs, age 16, patient reports bicycle accident. The pattern was there. Frequent injuries, vague explanations. Gaps in the stories that ER staff noted, but apparently didn't escalate far enough to trigger intervention. One name appeared repeatedly in the records. Dr. Raymond Park, the attending physician for 6 of Cheryl's 9 visits. I tracked him down. Retired now, but still living in Providence. When I called and explained I was researching childhood safety protocols for a security firm project, he agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Dr. Park was in his late 60s, gray-haired, with eyes that had seen too much preventable suffering. I bought him coffee and eased into the real conversation. When I mentioned Cheryl Rogers, his entire demeanor shifted. "I remember her," he said quietly, stirring sugar into his cup without drinking. "Bright kid. Came in too many times with injuries that didn't match her stories. I suspected something was wrong at home. I documented my concerns in every single report. Flagged it for social services twice." "What happened?" I asked. He looked tired. Her parents were convincing. The father was calm, articulate, explained everything away like he'd rehearsed it. The mother backed him up completely, and Cheryl herself would insist it was all accidents. Without her cooperation, without concrete proof of direct harm witnessed by medical staff, there wasn't much we could do legally. The system has limits. I could hear the regret in his voice. I've thought about her case for years, wondered if I should have pushed harder. Then I asked the question that changed everything. "Did you ever see similar patterns with other patients?" Dr. Park hesitated. Professional ethics warred with moral obligation on his face. Finally, he spoke. "About 5 years ago, a young woman came through our ER, Rebecca Mills. Same pattern of injuries, same vague explanations. She eventually disclosed she was in a relationship with an older man who was hurting her. She met him at the hardware store where she worked. He was a regular customer, started mentoring her. Then the relationship turned controlling and violent. She named him during a police interview." My heart was pounding. "Who?" "Keith Rogers." But she recanted her statement 2 weeks later, said she'd made it up during a mental health crisis. I heard later that Keith's wife testified for him, and his attorney systematically tore apart Rebecca's credibility. The young woman was isolated, terrified, and ultimately broke under the pressure. Charges were dropped. I sat back in my chair, the coffee shop noise fading around me. Keith hadn't stopped when Cheryl left home. He'd found another target, another victim, and he'd gotten away with it. I spent the next day tracking down Rebecca Mills. She was 26 now, working as a barista at a coffee shop on the outskirts of Providence. I approached carefully, honestly this time. Told her I was engaged to Keith Rogers' daughter and trying to understand what kind of man he really was. Rebecca's face went white. Her hands started trembling. She asked me to leave, said she couldn't talk about it. I handed her my business card and said quietly, "If you ever want someone to believe you, call me. I already believe you." I returned to Chicago on Friday evening, exhausted and carrying information that felt like it was burning through my briefcase. Saturday morning, I sat at my desk organizing everything I'd gathered: medical records, witness statements, Rebecca's contact information, trying to figure out how to tell Cheryl what I'd done. That afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown Rhode Island number. "This is Rebecca Mills," the voice said, shaky but determined. "Can we talk?" For the next hour, she told me everything. How Keith had groomed her with kindness before revealing his true nature. The months of control and violence. Going to police. Pressing charges, then having Megan Rogers testify against her. Calling her unstable, vindictive, a liar seeking attention. The case collapsed under the weight of their coordinated defense. "He's still out there," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "He'll do it again. He always does." After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at the Chicago skyline. I had 2 victims now. Medical records, witness testimony from a teacher and a doctor. A pattern spanning over a decade. But I also knew how these cases fell apart. Victims recant. Evidence gets dismissed. Abusers hire lawyers and walk away clean. If I was going to stop Keith Rogers, I needed to see what was happening in that house right now. I needed to know if there were other victims I hadn't found yet. I booked another flight to Providence. This time, I wouldn't be watching from a distance. I flew back to Chicago knowing I couldn't keep investigating in secret anymore. The weight of what I'd discovered, the diary, Providence, the teacher, the doctor, Rebecca Mills, felt like it was crushing my chest. That evening, I sat Cheryl down in our living room and confessed everything. I told her about finding the diary, reading it, traveling to Providence, talking to Ms. Delgado and Dr. Park, finding Rebecca Mills. Every word that came out of my mouth felt like a betrayal, because that's exactly what it was. Cheryl didn't yell. She didn't throw things or storm out. She just went completely silent, her face blank, eyes distant like she'd left her body. Then the tears came, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. "You had no right," she whispered between gasps for air. "You had no right to go there." I tried to explain, to justify why I'd violated her privacy, but there was no justification that made it okay. I'd crossed a line, and we both knew it. For 3 days, Cheryl barely spoke to me. She slept in the guest room, avoided eye contact, moved through our apartment like a ghost haunting her own life. I felt our engagement crumbling in my hands, felt the future we'd built disintegrating with every hour of her silence. Then, on the 4th night, Cheryl came to my office where I was pretending to work. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, but there was something different in her eyes. Not anger anymore, something closer to resignation, or maybe relief. "You want to know what happened?" she asked, her voice raw. "Fine. I'll tell you everything." For the first time in our 3 years together, Cheryl spoke about her childhood out loud. She described growing up in a house where love was conditional and violence was the language Keith spoke most fluently. His rage was completely unpredictable. You could be punished for anything or nothing at all. Megan wasn't just passive. She actively participated, gaslighting Cheryl into believing she caused the violence, that she was the problem. Cheryl talked about learning to make herself invisible, perfect, silent. It was never enough. She described the injuries I'd read about in medical records, the lies she told to protect people who were destroying her, the shame of being the kid everyone suspected was in trouble but no one actually saved. The worst part wasn't the pain, she said quietly. It was knowing that teachers saw the bruises, doctors filed reports, and everyone just moved on, like I wasn't worth the trouble of saving. Then she said something that stopped my heart. I have a younger brother. His name is Mason. He's about to turn 18. I stared at her. In 3 years, she'd never mentioned a brother. Not once. He was 11 when I left for college, Cheryl continued, her voice shaking. I thought if I just disappeared, maybe things would get better. Maybe Keith would calm down. I was 18 and terrified, and I convinced myself that leaving was the only way I'd survive. But Mason grew up in that house for 7 more years after I left. Her face crumpled. And I've done nothing. I left him there. Why didn't you ever mention him? I asked, trying to keep my voice gentle. Cheryl's face crumpled. Because every time I thought about him, the guilt was unbearable. I trained myself not to think about Mason, not to say his name, not to acknowledge I'd left him there. It was the only way I could function. If I let myself feel it, I'd fall apart. So I buried it completely. I became the person who had no family, no past, no brother slowly dying in the same house that almost killed me. Everything shifted in that moment. This wasn't just about Cheryl's past anymore. There was a 17-year-old kid still living in that house, still trapped in the same nightmare Cheryl had escaped. Is he being hurt? I asked carefully. I don't know for sure. He won't say directly. He's afraid of making things worse. But he's still there, Brian. Still living with them. I took her hands. Then we're going to get him out. We spent the next week planning carefully. I contacted Rebecca Mills again. She agreed to provide sworn testimony if needed. I reached out to Dr. Park and Ms. Delgado, who both agreed to provide written statements documenting what they'd witnessed years ago. I consulted with a family law attorney in Rhode Island, got advice on documenting potential ongoing harm and filing for emergency protective orders if necessary. Cheryl reconnected with Mason through carefully worded texts, trying to assess his situation without alerting Keith or Megan. His responses were guarded. I'm okay. Don't worry about me. Just a few more days until I turn 18 and can leave. He was counting down days until escape, exactly like Cheryl had. On Friday evening, a week after my confession, we booked flights to Providence for the following Monday. The night before we left, Cheryl stood at our apartment window, staring out at the city lights. What if this destroys everything? She whispered. I stood beside her. Then we build something new. But we're not leaving Mason there. The next morning, we flew to Providence. Together this time. The drive from the airport to Cheryl's childhood neighborhood felt suffocating. She hadn't been back in 7 years. Every street sign, every familiar corner, pulled her deeper into memories she'd spent years burying. I kept one hand on her knee, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone this time. When we turned onto her old street and the white 2-story house came into view, Cheryl stopped breathing. Her entire body went rigid. I can't do this, she whispered. Yes, you can, I said firmly. You're not that scared kid anymore. And Mason needs you. We parked across the street and sat for 10 minutes. Cheryl's hands were shaking. I could see her fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. Finally, she nodded. We got out of the car. I walked up to the front door first, Cheryl half a step behind me. I knocked 3 times. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Megan Rogers stood there, older than in the photos I'd seen, but still ordinary looking. Cardigan, reading glasses hanging from a chain, the kind of woman you'd think was harmless. Her eyes landed on Cheryl and widened with genuine surprise. Cheryl? Her voice was cautious, almost suspicious. What are you doing here? Cheryl's voice came out barely above a whisper. I came to see Mason. Megan's expression hardened immediately. This isn't a good time. I stepped forward. We're not leaving until we talk to him. Before Megan could respond, a voice boomed from inside the house. Who's at the door? Keith Rogers appeared behind his wife. Tall, broad-shouldered, exactly as I'd seen from a distance, but worse up close because he was smiling. Pleasant, the mask firmly in place. Cheryl, what a surprise. His tone was warm, paternal, completely fake. And you must be the fiancé. Brian, right? Megan and I were so disappointed not to get an invitation to meet you properly. The passive-aggressive jab was calculated, designed to put us on the defensive. I forced a polite smile. We're here now. We'd like to see Mason. Keith's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Of course. Come in. The house looked exactly as Cheryl had described. Clean, decorated, normal on the surface. But the air felt wrong, oppressive, like the walls themselves were holding secrets. Keith called upstairs. Mason, come down here. Your sister's visiting. Footsteps on the stairs. Then Mason appeared at the top of the landing. My heart broke when I saw him. He was 18 but looked younger. Thin, guarded, with the same haunted look Cheryl carried in her eyes. He should have been planning for college, excited about independence. Instead, he looked like someone who'd been surviving instead of living. Hey, Cheryl, he said quietly. Cheryl moved to hug him, but Keith smoothly stepped between them. Let's all sit down and have a proper conversation. It was phrased as a suggestion, but it was absolutely a command. We sat in the living room. Keith positioned himself in the center, controlling the space. Megan perched on the arm of his chair, a united front. Mason sat stiffly on the opposite couch, not looking at anyone. The tension was suffocating. I asked directly, Mason, are you okay here? Do you feel safe? Before Mason could open his mouth, Keith laughed. Of course he's safe. This is his home. Cheryl, what stories have you been telling your fiancé? Cheryl's voice shook but held steady. I told him the truth, about what you did to me, about how Mom watched and did nothing. The temperature in the room dropped. Keith's smile stayed frozen on his face, but his eyes turned icy. You always had such an active imagination, sweetheart. Made up stories for attention. Megan jumped in, voice dripping with false concern. Cheryl, honey, we know you've struggled with stability. We forgive you for cutting us off. But you can't come here making wild accusations. I watched Mason carefully. He hadn't said a word. His hands were clenched into tight fists, his jaw rigid. There was a fading bruise on his forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. When Keith shifted position, Mason flinched, just slightly, but unmistakably. Cheryl saw it too. Her face went pale. I stood up. Mason, you don't have to stay here. If you want to leave with us right now, you can. Keith's composure cracked. He stood too, bigger, more threatening. You need to leave my house. Now. Not without Mason, I said. Keith's face reddened. You have no legal right to him. He's my son. You're nobody. I took a step forward. I know about Rebecca Mills. I have medical records, witness statements, proof of everything you've done. Keith moved inches from my face.